Welcome to Really Understanding Incoterms 2020, a series of comprehensive masterclasses. This is Lesson 14, FAS, Free Alongside Ship at a Named Port of Shipment. But first, the necessary disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer. The contents of this course are not legal advice. I was a member of the International Chamber of Commerce's Incoterms 2020 drafting group, which created these rules. Some of the contents are direct quotes from the Incoterms 2020 publication 723E of the ICC. My explanations and my comments and my opinions in this lesson are based on my knowledge and my experience of over 5 decades. My intent in creating this comprehensive course on Incoterms 2020 is to ensure that my knowledge and my experience is passed on to you for a better future for you in trade. In this lesson, we're looking specifically at FAS, the more complex and contentious articles, especially A2 and B2, delivery and taking delivery with its 2 unstated options and A10, B10 notices. We'll then look at the maybe strange A6 and B6 delivery transport document and A9 and B9 allocation of costs. As always, I'll explain what the book says first, which is where the other trainers and YouTube videos usually stop if they get that far, but then I'll examine the issues arising from these articles as we go along. A2, delivery. The seller must deliver the goods either by placing them alongside the vessel nominated by the buyer, at the loading point, if any, indicated by the buyer, at the named port of shipment, or by procuring the goods so delivered. The seller must deliver the goods, 1, on the agreed date, or 2, at the time within the agreed period notified by the buyer under B10, or 3, if no such time is notified, then at the end of the agreed period, and 4, in the manner customary at the port. If no specific loading point has been indicated by the buyer, the seller may select the point within the named port of shipment that best suits its purpose. What does option 3 mean? If no such time is notified, then at the end of the agreed period. This is a legal construct for contract purposes, to say that if the seller cannot actually deliver because the buyer didn't give the required information, then at the end of the agreed period, the seller is deemed to actually have delivered anyway. Let's look at the first and last paragraphs again. The first, the seller must deliver the goods either by placing them alongside the vessel nominated by the buyer, at the loading point, if any, indicated by the buyer, at the named port of shipment, or by procuring the goods so delivered. And the last paragraph, if no specific loading point has been indicated by the buyer, the seller may select the point within the named port of shipment that best suits its purpose. Is there a contradiction? Does the last paragraph even make sense? How can that last paragraph work? If no specific loading point has been indicated by the buyer, the seller may select the point within the named port of shipment that best suits its purpose. Well, logistically and logically it can't work. This is again simply a legal construct to mean that if the buyer fails to indicate a specific point or its vessel fails to turn up, then at the end of the contract period, the seller has delivered anyway. It goes hand in hand with option 3. Of course, the seller can't just put its goods on any wharf it feels like. This rule can only be used for bulk or break bulk by sea or inland waterway. Indeed, it's the first of 4 rules under the heading Rules for Sea and Inland Waterway Transport. FAS is not appropriate where goods are handed over to a carrier before they're alongside the vessel, such as with containers, and of course, air, rail or road. Containers go by ship. Why then is FAS inappropriate for containers? Well, in a freight collect transaction, the seller hands its goods to the buyer's carrier, either at its own premises or at a terminal like a container yard or a container freight station. The seller does not control when or by whom the container is moved alongside the vessel, ready for loading on board. In fact, in FAS, there is no carrier involved, only the vessel itself. There are typically 2 options for where delivery is to take place. On the quay or wharf alongside the vessel ready for loading, or on a barge or similar alongside the vessel ready for loading. Note though that the vessel must already be present to deliver alongside. Until that time, waiting for the vessel to arrive, the goods have not been delivered and remain at the seller's risk. Now, what does "or by procuring the goods so delivered" mean? It refers to a string sale in which a first buyer, buying the goods which are alongside its vessel, then sells those goods so procured under a separate contract to the next buyer, and so on. Does it happen in practice? Well, who knows? The drafting group was not presented with any actual data to show that FAS is used at all, just anecdotally that it is used very rarely. The FAS rule was very nearly deleted. B2, the buyer must take delivery of the goods when they have been delivered under A2. This means that the buyer has taken delivery in the seller's country, either on a quay or wharf or on a barge, maybe hours or a day or days before actual export, the physical loading on board the vessel. If something happens to the goods within the seller's country while on the quay or the barge, that's of no concern to the seller. Or is it? That's going to be a matter of payment arrangements. Would a buyer want to pay for goods damaged before they take physical control of them? A10 and B10 notices. A10, the seller must give the buyer sufficient notice, either that the goods have been delivered in accordance with A2, or that the vessel has failed to take delivery of the goods within the time agreed. And B10, the buyer must give the seller sufficient notice of any transport-related security requirements, the vessel name, the loading point, and, if any, the selected delivery date within the agreed period. Now, clearly, B10 should occur before A10. The buyer needs to inform the seller where and when to deliver, and the seller then informs the buyer of delivery or being unable to deliver because there is no vessel to be alongside of. In FAS, does the vessel take delivery? No. The goods are only alongside, and placing them on the vessel is not the seller's obligation. A6, delivery transport document. the seller must provide the buyer, at the seller's cost, with the usual proof that the goods have been delivered in accordance with A2, unless such proof is a transport document. The seller must provide assistance to the buyer, at the buyer's request, risk and cost, in obtaining a transport document. What is this usual proof for delivery alongside a vessel? That will depend on the custom of the port, the nature of the goods, and even the type of vessel. How would a seller obtain a transport document when it has nothing to do with that transport? Again, this will depend on many variables, including what is agreed in the sales contract and the contract of carriage. B6. The buyer must accept the proof of delivery provided under A6. That's all. A9. Allocation of costs. The seller must pay A. all costs relating to the goods until they have been delivered in accordance with A2, other than those payable by the buyer under B9, which we'll see very shortly. The seller must pay B the costs of providing the usual proof to the buyer under A6 that the goods have been delivered. The seller must pay C, where applicable, duties, taxes and any other costs related to export clearance under A7A. And the seller must pay D, the buyer, for all costs and charges related to the buyer providing assistance in obtaining documents and information in accordance with B7A. B9 allocation of costs. The buyer must pay A, all costs relating to the goods from the time they have been delivered under A2, other than those payable by the seller under A9. The buyer must pay B, the seller, for all costs and charges related to the seller providing assistance in obtaining documents and information which the buyer required in accordance with A4, A5, A6 and A7B, example, certificate of origin, etc. The buyer must pay C, where applicable, duties, taxes and any other costs related to transit or import clearance under B7B. And the buyer must pay D, any additional costs incurred either because 1. the buyer has failed to give notice under B10, or 2. the vessel nominated by the buyer under B10 fails to arrive on time, fails to take the goods, or closes for cargo earlier than the time notified in accordance with B10, provided that the goods have been clearly identified by the seller as the contract goods. B9A doesn't say the obvious in plain words, but it means that the buyer pays for all wharf storage charges beyond the time of the seller's delivery onto that wharf or the barge being alongside, loading of the goods on board, freight and all further charges. FAS and letters of credit. How does an LC function with an FAS transaction? Well, it doesn't. LCs almost invariably specify a port of loading, port of discharge, latest date of shipment, and require presentation of an onboard bill of lading. But the only thing the seller knows for sure is where and when it delivered. An LC for an FAS transaction should only require presentation of the seller's invoice and a copy of some form of cargo receipt. However, The seller should be aware the buyer now already has control of the goods. The LC can't be used to hold the goods for ransom against payment. The seller is not the shipper, although it is the exporter. And there is no provision in the SWIFT LC format for a later state of receipt of goods alongside a vessel. So as a buyer, what do I request my bank to state in such an LC? Only field 44A, place of taking in charge. They are not to show 44E, port of loading, or 44F, port of discharge. They are not to show field 44C, latest date of shipment. They are to require presentation of a cargo receipt dated no later than X date, showing a place of receipt instead of an onboard bill of lading, without specifying who is to be the issuer of that receipt, as I previously explained. So in summary, this rule is only suitable for bulk or break bulk by ship. The seller delivers to a wharf or on a barge. The vessel must be present to deliver alongside it. The seller carries out export formalities, but the seller does not ship. The buyer contracts for carriage. The buyer's risk commences within the seller's country before the goods cross the export border. This rule is not compatible with LCs. And this rule apparently is very rarely used and was almost deleted. Next lesson then will be FOB, A2 and B2 delivery, taken delivery, then A10, B10 notices, A6 and B6 delivery and transport document, and A9, B9 allocation of costs. Again, as always, I'll explain what the book says first, which is where the others stop if they get that far, but then I will examine the issues arising for these articles as we go along, just as I have with this rule FAS and previous ones. If you like this lesson, please click on the thumbs up button below. If you'd like to be alerted to each new lesson, please just hit the subscribe button and the bell. And please feel free to leave any comments and questions relevant to this lesson below. Till next lesson.